I'm not proud of this, and I'm not posting for sympathy. I guess I'm posting because this is one of those memories that keeps resurfacing at inconvenient times, like when I'm brushing my teeth or stuck at a red light, and I'm tired of pretending it didn't happen. So here it is. One of my crimes. Insurance fraud. Small on paper, heavier in real life. At the time, I was in my late 20s, broke in that specific way where you're technically functioning but one surprise expense away from freefall. I had a car that drank oil, a job that paid just enough to keep me trapped, and a quiet resentment toward how easily other people seemed to stay afloat. When something went wrong with the car, something borderline, something I could maybe spin, I saw an opening. Not a grand scheme. Just a nudge of reality in my favor. I told myself it wasn't really stealing. I told myself insurance companies expect people like me to take advantage. I told myself I deserved a break. The lie came fully formed long before I ever spoke it out loud. I rehearsed it in the shower, in traffic, lying in bed staring at the ceiling. I had the words down. The pauses. The tone. The part where I sounded tired but honest. Still, when the time came, I stumbled. And that stumble is what made everything that followed feel real and terrifying. The truth is, I didn't wake up one morning and decide to commit insurance fraud. It felt more like drifting into it, the way you drift into bad habits, slow, incremental, with plenty of time to talk yourself out of noticing what you're doing. The car had already been giving me trouble for months. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep me anxious every time I turned the key. When the repair estimate came back higher than the car was worth, something in me snapped, not loudly, just a quiet internal click. I remember staring at the paper the mechanic handed me, nodding like I understood, while my brain was already rearranging facts. I wasn't inventing a fantasy. I was editing reality. Changing the timing. Adjusting the cause. Telling myself that if the outcome was the same, me without a car, then the story behind it didn't matter as much as people pretended it did. Money was the obvious motive, but it wasn't the only one. There was pride involved. A refusal to call my parents for help again. A refusal to admit I couldn't handle adulthood as well as I pretended. Filing a claim felt cleaner than begging or borrowing. It felt like using the system instead of letting the system use me. By the time I got home that day, the decision was already made, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I didn't say, I'm going to lie. I said, I'll see what my options are. That was the first lie. The easiest one. Once the idea settled in, it didn't feel dangerous anymore. It felt procedural. That's the part that scares me now, how quickly my brain switched from should I to how do I. I started researching without calling it research. Just casual Googling. Insurance claim process. What counts as accident damage? What not to say to an adjuster? I told myself it was just being informed. The lie itself took shape over a couple of days. I'd tweak it, test it internally, stress test it like a bad screenplay. Where was I? What time was it? Who might have seen something? I made sure it was boring. Nothing dramatic. No high-speed nonsense, no villains, no cinematic flair. Just a normal, forgettable incident that could happen to anyone on an unremarkable Tuesday. I practiced saying it out loud when I was alone. I paid attention to where my voice naturally hesitated and tried to smooth those parts out. I even practiced correcting myself, adding a small, intentional mistake so I could remember the detail later. I'd read somewhere that liars who self-correct seem more credible. That fact stuck with me more than it should have. What I didn't rehearse was how my body would react. The tightness in my chest. The way my hands felt slightly disconnected from the rest of me, like they belonged to someone else. I assumed confidence was something you could fake indefinitely, like posture. I didn't realize how much of it leaks out through things you can't consciously control. By the time I picked up the phone to call my insurance company, the story felt real in my head. Not true, but solid. Like a script I'd memorized well enough to forget it was written. I sat in my car when I made the call, even though I didn't need to. Something about being in the driver's seat made it feel official, like method acting for liars. I remember gripping the steering wheel with one hand while the other hovered near my phone, thumbs slick with sweat. I waited until I stopped feeling nervous, then waited another minute. I wanted to sound calm, inconvenienced, normal. The automated system did its thing, and I used that time to breathe and silently run through my opening line one last time. When the adjuster finally came on, she sounded exactly how I feared she would: alert, friendly, professional. Not cold, not suspicious. Worse. Neutral. Like someone who had heard every version of every story and was trained to care just enough. I started strong. Gave my name, policy number, location. Then I launched into the lie. The first half came out clean, almost too clean, and that's when my brain betrayed me. I skipped a detail I'd planned to include. Realized it mid-sentence. Tried to backtrack without sounding like I was backtracking. My voice did that subtle pitch shift people pretend doesn't happen when they're nervous. She paused. Just for a beat. Long enough for my stomach to drop. Okay, she said slowly, and I hated how calm she was. And this happened when exactly? I gave the time. The wrong one. Caught it immediately. Corrected myself. Just like I'd rehearsed. But instead of feeling clever, I felt exposed. Like I'd just shown her the strings. She didn't call me out. She didn't need to. She just typed, occasionally humming or making those non-committal noises that told me she was listening. By the end of the call, the claim was filed. No alarms. No accusations. When I hung up, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to sit there for a while before I could drive. I'd crossed the line, and nothing had stopped me. That was somehow the most unsettling part. After the call, there was nothing to do but wait, which turned out to be worse than lying. Waiting gave my brain room to replay every sentence I'd said, every pause, every breath I took that might have sounded wrong. I became convinced I'd already been flagged, that there was a silent note on my file marked "Watch this guy." I checked my email obsessively, like guilt had given me a new nervous tick. A couple days later, the adjuster emailed asking for photos. That was expected. Still, seeing the request made my stomach flip. I went out to the car with my phone and started taking pictures, trying to make damage look accidental without looking staged. I kept thinking, is this too much? Not enough? Does this look fake? I took way more photos than necessary, then deleted half of them because they felt incriminating just existing on my phone. What surprised me was how ordinary the process felt. Upload photos. Answer a few follow-up questions. Confirm my statement in writing. It felt like any other bureaucratic hoop, and that normalcy made it easier to forget what I was actually doing. I wasn't breaking into a vault or forging signatures. I was clicking buttons and attaching files. At the same time, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every email notification made my heart race. When my phone rang from an unknown number, I let it go to voicemail, convinced it was someone calling to say they knew. It never was. It was always a spam call or a dentist's office or my mom. The waiting stretched on just long enough for me to start believing I might actually get away with it. That belief didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of fear. The kind that settles in once you realize the lie is no longer theoretical. It's out there now, moving on its own, and you don't get to control where it goes next. Just when my nerves had started to dull into a constant background buzz, I got the email, an in-person inspection. Short, polite, unavoidable. A date and a time window. A name. I read it 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood. I hadn't. The night before, I barely slept. I kept imagining scenarios where I'd missed something obvious. Tire marks that didn't line up, damage inconsistent with my story, some tiny mechanical truth that would unravel everything. I went outside with a flashlight at midnight like a paranoid raccoon, staring at the car from different angles, convincing myself it looked normal enough. Whatever that meant. The inspector showed up mid-morning. Middle-aged guy, clipboard, neutral expression. He didn't introduce himself with authority or suspicion. He just said my name to confirm it was me and asked if he could take a look. That casual professionalism threw me off more than an interrogation would have. There was no drama to rise to. I stood there while he circled the car, snapping photos, crouching, making notes. Every click of his camera felt like a verdict being quietly drafted. He asked a couple of clarifying questions, nothing accusatory, just specifics, and I answered them with the version of the truth I'd memorized. My mouth said the words, my body reacted like I was being chased. At one point, he frowned at something near the wheel well and took a few extra photos. My heart started hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. I considered volunteering an explanation, then remembered that over-explaining is what guilty people do. So I stayed quiet. The silence felt loud. When he finally closed his clipboard and said, "All right, that should do it," I nodded like this was all perfectly routine. He thanked me for my time and left. I watched his car disappear down the street, then went back inside and sat on the floor, back against the door, trying to slow my breathing. I'd survived another checkpoint, but I knew better than to call it a win. Not yet. The day after the inspection, I started noticing cracks where there hadn't been any before. Not in the car, in me. I'd catch myself mentally revising the story again, even though there was no one left to tell it to. I'd replay the inspector's questions and hear my own answers echo back slightly off, like a recording with a delay. The lie had stopped being something I used and started being something I maintained. Friends asked casual questions. "So what's going on with the car? Insurance cover it?" Normal stuff. I gave them the sanitized version, and every time I did, I felt a little jolt of panic that they'd ask a follow-up I wasn't prepared for. Nobody did. That almost made it worse. I was carrying this extra weight alone, and it made everyday conversations feel like narrow bridges. I also started justifying harder. In my head, mostly. I'd think about premiums and deductibles and faceless corporations and remind myself how replaceable I was to them. I'd tally up past months of paying on time like moral credits. I wasn't trying to convince anyone else anymore. I was trying to convince myself that this wasn't the kind of thing that defined a person. Then came the email saying the claim was under final review. 3 words that turned my stomach. Final review sounded like scrutiny. Like a last chance for someone to notice the seam in the story where I'd stitched 2 realities together. I told myself it was procedural. I told myself that if something was wrong, I'd know by now. But at night, lying in bed, I'd feel that old surge of adrenaline, the same one from the phone call, from the inspection, like my body hadn't gotten the memo that the danger was supposed to be passing. It was as if some part of me knew this wasn't over yet, even if the paperwork said otherwise. The almost is the part that still makes my stomach tighten. A few days into the final review, I got a call while I was at work. Unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing, then immediately hated myself for not answering. 5 minutes later, an email followed, polite and brief, asking me to call back to clarify a detail. I locked myself in a stairwell and dialed. The adjuster wasn't the same woman from the first call. This guy had a warmer voice, almost chatty, and that somehow felt more dangerous. He asked about the timing again, nothing new, just confirming. I answered, then he asked a question that wasn't on my rehearsal list. Something small about where the car had been parked earlier that day. I hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Long enough to feel it. I filled the space with a laugh I didn't mean to make, then answered anyway. The answer fit. It made sense. But it wasn't the answer I'd practiced, and as soon as I said it, I knew I'd introduced a new variable. He didn't react. He thanked me, said that helped, and told me I'd hear back soon. The call ended with the same professional calm I'd come to dread. I went back to my desk and pretended to work while my brain ran in circles, mapping how that new detail might intersect with everything else I'd already said. For the rest of the day, I waited for the follow-up. The actually call. The email pointing out the inconsistency. It never came. By the time I left work, my nerves were so fried that I felt hollow, like I'd burned through all my panic and had nothing left to give. That night, I realized something uncomfortable. I was getting better at this. Adjusting on the fly. Lying without a script. And instead of relief, that realization filled me with a quiet, creeping shame. The phrase, approval pending, showed up in my online account a day later, and I stared at it like it might change if I looked away. Pending felt like purgatory. Not guilty, not free. Just suspended in a moment that could tip either way depending on someone else's mood, workload, or attention to detail. I started imagining the adjusters as a loose network of people quietly comparing notes. I pictured my file being passed around, someone circling a sentence in red, another person shrugging and saying, "Looks fine to me." I knew that wasn't how it worked, but guilt makes you creative. Every system becomes a courtroom if you're waiting for judgment. What got to me most was how life around the light kept going. Meetings. Lunch breaks. Grocery runs. I'd be standing in line deciding between brands of cereal while part of my brain was braced for impact, like something terrible could happen at any second. The disconnect was exhausting. I felt like I was carrying contraband in plain sight. When the email finally came saying the claim was approved and a payout was being processed, my first reaction wasn't relief. It was disbelief. I reread it 3 times, half expecting a follow-up that said, "Just kidding, please call us immediately." My hands shook as I forwarded it to myself, as if saving a copy would make it more real. The relief hit later, all at once, like my body had been holding its breath without telling me. I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, then immediately felt sick about it. I'd won. That was the word my brain used. Not resolved. Not finished. Won. And I didn't like what that said about me. The deposit hit my account on a Thursday morning. No fanfare. Just numbers updating on a screen while I was half awake, coffee cooling on the counter. I refreshed the page twice to make sure it wasn't a glitch. It wasn't. The money was there, clean and quiet, like it had always belonged to me. I expected a rush. Something cinematic. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like I was watching someone else's life from a few inches to the left. I paid the repair bill the same day, methodical and efficient, trying not to think about how smoothly everything was moving now that the hardest part was over. The mechanic thanked me. The car got fixed. The world kept turning. That night, the guilt finally found a place to land. Not the dramatic kind, no sweating, no tears, but a low, persistent pressure behind my ribs. I kept thinking about how easy it had been for the money to slide from a faceless company into my very real checking account. How normal it all looked from the outside. How no one around me had any idea. I told myself I'd use the extra to get ahead. Pay down debt. Be responsible. Make this mean something. But even that felt like another justification layered on top of the first one. A way to launder the feeling, not just the money. When I went to bed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt older. Like I'd crossed some invisible line and realized too late that the view on the other side wasn't any better, just lonelier. I thought once the money settled and the car was fixed, the whole thing would fade into the background like a bad dream. Instead, it lingered in small, annoying ways. Every time I logged into my bank account, I remembered where part of that balance came from. Every time I drove the car, I thought about how easily I'd rewritten its history. I became weirdly jumpy. Mail from the insurance company, even routine stuff, made my pulse spike. I'd open envelopes slowly, bracing for some delayed reckoning. There never was one. Just newsletters, policy updates, reminders to review coverage. Normal life stuff. The lack of consequences started to feel like a consequence all on its own. I also noticed a shift in how I thought about myself. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say there, that's it. More like a hairline crack in a mirror. I still looked the same, acted the same, but there was this private knowledge humming underneath everything, you did this. And you got away with it. That knowledge made it easier to rationalize other small things. Nothing criminal, but softer edges around right and wrong. White lies felt lighter. Cutting corners felt justified. I didn't like that slope once I noticed it, but noticing didn't magically fix it either. The scariest part wasn't the fear of being caught anymore. It was the quiet realization that the world hadn't pushed back at all, and that maybe the only real line I'd crossed was one inside myself. A few months later, I got selected for a routine policy review. That phrase landed like a dropped plate. I reread the email over and over, searching for subtext, for any hint that this was connected to the claim. My brain immediately jumped to images of audits, recorded calls, timelines being rechecked with fresh eyes. The review turned out to be exactly what it said it was. A short questionnaire. Updated mileage. Confirmation of address. Nothing about the claim. Nothing about the story. I filled it out carefully, hands still a little shaky, and sent it back. When I didn't hear anything afterward, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. That should have been the end of it. Final confirmation that I was in the clear. Instead, it left me unsettled. I'd been braced for impact for so long that the absence of it felt wrong, like missing a step on a staircase. I realized part of me had been waiting for punishment, not because I wanted it, but because it would have made things simpler. Cause, effect. Sin, consequence. Without that, I was left alone with the knowledge of what I'd done, and no external marker to say when I was allowed to move on. No closing argument. No verdict. Just silence. I remember thinking, so this is it. Not freedom. Not justice. Just the quiet continuation of a life that now had a hidden footnote attached to it, one only I would ever read. Time did what it always does, it smoothed the edges. The sharp panic dulled into something more manageable, like a scar you only notice when you press on it. Days went by where I didn't think about the claim at all. Then weeks. Then months. And every time I realized I'd forgotten, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, like I was betraying some internal obligation to remember. But it never fully went away. Certain moments would drag it back to the surface without warning. Filling out forms that asked if all information provided was true. Listening to someone rant about fraud like it was an abstract concept, a moral failure that belonged to other people. I'd nod along, feeling slightly out of sync, like I was half a beat behind everyone else. I became more cautious, too. Not just about lying, about everything. I double-checked emails before sending them. Over-explained harmless mistakes. Apologized more than necessary. It was like I was trying to rebalance some internal scale, even though no one else could see it tipping. What bothered me most was how ordinary I still felt. I wasn't some mastermind. I wasn't reckless. I was just a guy who'd made a calculated decision under pressure and lived with the outcome. That normalcy scared me more than the crime itself. It meant this wasn't an exception. It was a possibility. Something I was capable of, given the right mix of fear and justification. And once you know that about yourself, you don't get to unknow it. I used to think character was this fixed thing you either had or didn't. Like honesty was a trait you could check off a list and move on from. After all this, I see it more like a muscle, or maybe a callus. Something that changes shape depending on how you use it, or don't. The fraud didn't turn me into a criminal mastermind or ruin my life. It did something quieter. It made me aware of how flexible my morals could be under pressure, how quickly I could build a logical scaffold around something I knew was wrong and climb it without looking down. That awareness stuck. It shows up whenever I'm tired, stressed, or feeling cornered by circumstances. There were moments afterward when temptations surfaced again, not the same kind, not as blatant, but adjacent. Little opportunities to misrepresent, to omit, to let someone else absorb the cost of my comfort. Each time, I felt that old familiar ease whispering, "You know how to do this." That scared me enough to pull back. I didn't confess. I didn't donate the money or report myself or do anything that would wrap the story up neatly. Life doesn't do neat endings. What I did do was start paying attention to the moments where I'd normally slide. I learned where my justifications come from. What fear sounds like when it puts on a reasonable voice. If this story has a turning point, it's not the payout or the inspection or the phone calls. It's the realization that the biggest consequence wasn't legal or financial. It was internal. It was learning that I'm not immune, and that staying honest isn't about never being tempted. It's about recognizing when you are. I'm telling this now not because I think it makes me interesting, or because I want absolution from strangers on the internet. I'm telling it because this is what the aftermath actually looks like when you get away with something. No sirens. No courtroom drama. Just a quiet shift in how you see yourself, and the uncomfortable knowledge that you were capable of crossing a line when it suited you. What I learned is that the most dangerous part of a lie isn't the risk of being caught, it's how reasonable it feels while you're telling it. How easy it is to frame it as temporary, harmless, justified. How quickly you stop thinking of it as a lie at all and start thinking of it as a solution. That's the part no one warns you about. If you're reading this and you're anywhere near a similar decision, financially desperate, backed into a corner, telling yourself it's just a system and not a person, I won't pretend a Reddit post will magically change your mind. I will say this, even when it works, it stays with you. It becomes a reference point. A quiet, remember when, that shows up when you least expect it. I didn't lose my freedom. I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose my car. What I lost was the ability to believe, without qualification, that I'd always do the right thing just because it was the right thing. And maybe that's not dramatic enough to scare anyone straight, but it's honest. That's my confession. Take from it what you want. I already took what I needed from it, and I'm still paying for it in ways no spreadsheet will ever show.